Hi, I'm Karin Hedberg. I'm with the Conferences and Camps office here on campus, and I'm a third culture kid. So I hope you enjoyed the little video that gave you a little introduction into what that is. So what is it? There's a quote that I remember hearing in the 1980s from a professor and sociologist, Morris Massey. What you are is where you are when. Or, as I like to say it, you are what you are because of where you were when. So we're all formed from our experiences. The third culture kid experience is a complicated one. When Barack Obama was elected president, I got him. It wasn't because he was a Democrat espousing a left-centrist platform. It wasn't because he was a person of color. It was because, as I learned about his life story, I related to his experiences. And because of that, I understood his worldview. Obama was the product of the marriage of an American white woman and a black Kenyan man. His parents met in Hawaii while they were both studying Russian. Later, his mother married an Indonesian man. Young Barack lived in Indonesia during his childhood, attending local schools and learning the Indonesian language. For the rest of her life, his mother lived in Indonesia and Hawaii, and both Barack and his half-Indonesian sister, Maya, visited often. Barack Obama is a third culture kid, and his story is very familiar to me, while at the same time he appeared very unfamiliar and even foreign to many American voters. I was also born to an American mother and a non-American father. I was born in Sweden, my father's country. After my parents married, they raised 3 children in 6 different countries. My brothers started school in Sweden. We all attended an English school in Jamaica and an international school in Rome, Italy. My high school years were spent in another international school in Germany. My high school graduating class of 40 students represented 10 nationalities. My school friends had come from over 35 countries. I could converse comfortably in 3 languages other than English. I've always held a U.S. passport, though I do not wholly identify with the United States. I too am a third culture kid, and now an adult third culture kid. When I left school in Germany, started college in Ohio, the transition was not an easy one. My contemporaries did not know exactly what to do with me. I mostly looked and sounded American, but they evidently perceived a foreignness they couldn't understand. I tried to fit in, but it was sometimes met with odd questions, rude comments on what I misunderstood about American culture and language, and even the occasional remark, "Wow, you're different." After that, I mostly focused on assimilating as best I could and avoid telling the story of my life. Today, I have a much better understanding of that difference and of American culture, though admittedly it still sometimes baffles me. I too am a third culture kid. Let's begin with some background. Following World War II, international business, commerce, and diplomacy exploded. My father, who was a Swedish-educated engineer, joined the international division of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, which expanded its presence globally during the 50s and 60s. Other major corporations followed suit. The rebuilding of post-war Europe and Japan started the modern globalization movement. In Europe, Japan, and the Middle East, private international schools were open to provide education to the dependents of corporate executives, diplomats, United Nations agencies, and other NGOs, and even visual and performing artists. Even the increasing American military presence in some of these locations resulted in the construction of large military bases that included family residences, schools, grocery stores, and community centers. However, it must be said, these bases were somewhat isolated and insulated from the larger international community. In the 1950s, sociologist and anthropologist Ruth Hill Useem began to study the dependence of this growing population, or this growing international workforce, which included corporate executives, missionaries, and so-called military brats. Dr. Useem first lived outside the U.S. in the early 50s, conducting research with her husband, John, in India on persons who had received a higher education in a Western country. Because the Useems brought their children with them, they began to observe and describe what they eventually called a third culture experience. In time, Ruth described these dependents as third culture kids, or TCKs. And she formulated this definition. A third culture kid is a person who has spent a significant part of his or her developmental years outside their parents' culture. A third culture kid builds relationships to all cultures while not having full ownership of any. And although the elements from each culture are assimilated into third culture kids' life experience, the sense of belonging is in relationship to others of the same background and other TCKs. So the critical piece here is the developmental years. It's the formation of your culture. The book that I'm drawing some of this information from, which is Third Culture Kids, this is a later edition, originally written by David Pollock, who is now dead, but the research was continued by his son and another researcher, Ruth Van Rieken. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the research has continued, but this was the first attempt to try to understand what was different about this population and how we acquired culture differently from children who grew up primarily in a monoculture. What Yusim discovered in her research and others later in theirs is that there are distinctive behavioral and life patterns that emerge in this population, and quite often differs from people who are raised in primarily a monocultural experience. One of them is rootlessness, as you saw in the film. We tend to struggle with the definition of home. Home can be associated with one or more geographic locations, or it can be associated with where family reside, or both. We have trouble feeling completely at home in one place, but we can also feel at home in many. When people ask, "Where are you from?" that $64 million question, we often respond based on what we think the questioner is seeking from us. So you might say, "I'm from here," or "I'm from Ohio," just to kind of keep it simple and not delve into your past. Or you might respond with a list of where you grew up or where you were born. Or we might actually avoid the question altogether because it's complicated. In my personal experience, I am happy to be settled in one place now, especially as I get older. But the feeling of missing out on other places is very real. For people with a monocultural experience, the answer to the question, "Where are you from?" can be as specific as a small town or even a street or a neighborhood to identify your relationship to the person asking the question. But when you come from far away, it's much harder to explain. Restlessness is another factor. We can experience the need to keep moving to avoid settling in one place. For those who experience frequent moves, this is quite common. My own brother traveled relentlessly through his 20s and 30s until finally in his late 40s he settled in one place to forge longer-term relationships. And speaking of relationships, it's complicated. And by that I mean we are simultaneously good at making friends and good at leaving them. But parting has its price, and the experience of frequent departures and losses can make many of us fear it more and more. In my own experience, I still cry when I take people to airports, both coming and going. And I even hate it when lunch is over with a friend. I can remember often having the feeling of never seeing people again when we were getting ready to move to a new place. This can also translate to a fear of intimacy because the fear of loss is so great. It's not uncommon for TCKs to have multiple relationships and marriages. Adaptability. Because of our cross-cultural experience, we tend to become good at figuring out new cultures, while at the same time not being able to completely immerse ourselves in them. We become adept at learning new languages, new customs, and understanding that the rules change in each new place. And let me add that usually the kids are better at this than the adults. It was my observation, first let me say my parents were always had a sense of adventure and really wanted to go places, and so they prepared us well in terms of where the next place was going. We would get out the maps, we would look at where we're going, we'd get out National Geographic magazines, and we would make an adventure of it. Not everybody's parents did that fully. I knew some friends whose whose families were in disagreement about making that transition, and some of the adults had a much harder time assimilating. Uneven maturity is a factor. A lot is written about the growth continuum of TCKs. Because of our experience, those aspects of our character that tend to develop more fully are those associated with global awareness, relating to adults, communication skills, and early autonomy. But those aspects that can suffer in development as a result of those associated with normal adolescent development and can result in prolonged adolescent development. One example is that typical adolescent behaviors, such as experimentation and rebelliousness, can be delayed. I know that was true in my case. Unresolved grief. Many of the losses are not visible or recognized by others. With no language or understanding to process their losses, many TCKs have never learned to deal with them as they happened, and the grief comes out in other ways: denial, anger, depression, extreme busyness, etc. Our adult life. Many TCKs end up living all over the world, and often not in their parents' country of origin. Many of my school friends have started their adult lives in most of the most unlikely places, married people from different cultures, and moved around themselves. They often tend to choose professions that involve diplomacy and other global international concerns. I have Japanese friends from high school who are married to Australians. I have a German friend who's married to an American, and they stayed in Germany. You know, the list goes on and on and on. Re-entry. This is an especially complicated issue for those of us who ultimately return to our passport countries, often for college. This is the subject of a lot of conversation among TCKs at reunions. Every single one of us has stories to share about how our counterparts responded to us and how we struggled to adapt, particularly at that age. As I stated previously, the questions were odd, the comments were sometimes hurtful. But as we had learned to do in other parts of the world, we adapted. We learned the language and the customs, and we learned to fit in time. Empathy. I personally think TCKs experience more empathy for those who are different from themselves. When you are continually having to adapt to new situations, you are never in the majority. When you see how other people live and how you must fit in, you become a keener observer. Everything I've talked about so far is primarily related to what more recent research has referred to the traditional TCK. And that's this definition here: non-military government kids, which often includes those associated with the diplomatic corps, religious and missionary kids, business kids like myself, those associated with multinational corporations, and a lot of other employers. When we were living in Rome, Italy, the international school we went to had filmmakers, had actors and actresses, some quite famous, because of the film industry that was quite lively in Rome in those years. Also people associated with United Nations and NATO causes. And by the way, let me emphasize too that at the time that I lived in Europe, which is different than it is today, there was a very large American military presence in Europe. And the schools that were provided by the American military for those dependents were separate from the schools that we went to. We couldn't go to those schools unless our parents were associated with the military. I think that changed over time, but so that's why I said there is a distinction for some of those, in some of those situations, depending on where those families lived, how long they were there, because those large bases tended to sort of mimic American culture. And there wasn't as much connection with the outside world, although there had to be some, of course. One thing that I found interesting reading this book is that the further research that has been done, I'm sure many of you are thinking in your minds, especially those of you who are younger, surely this can't be all the people in the world who are having this experience. There are many, many, hundreds and thousands of years of migration in our human history. And so when David Pollock's son, Michael, and Ruth Reekin wrote the next edition of this book, they began to look at what they started to call CrossCultural Kids, which is an expanded definition. I found this particularly interesting because I actually first heard about the term third culture kid when I was in college, and I was actually the subject of a study. Ruth Useem was working, the original researcher for TCK was doing a lot of research still in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s. And she and her other fellow researchers traveled to several schools in the colleges in the United States to gather further research, and I was a subject of one of those studies. But this later research is interesting because they're looking at the expanded cross-cultural experiences that children can have when they're moving around, some not so happy. So nowadays, you'll see sites that refer to, like websites and literature referring to TCKs and CCKs, which includes the traditional TCKs, that's hard to say, isn't it, that we talked about, but also children who are from bi and multicultural and bi and multiracial families, children of immigrants. It's pretty clear that there would be a lot of cultural adaptation, particularly in the political climate of today, to American culture and how to assimilate and how you can't assimilate and so forth. Children of refugees, can you imagine how incredibly difficult that must be? These are not happy experiences for many people who are families who are forced to leave their homes, not only their homes, but their countries often. Children of minorities, there's a lot written in the book about how even in the United States, there's going to be a certain degree of cultural adaptation that children of minorities are going to have to experience when they leave their home and go to school and enter into the more majority white culture. So there are, and I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist, but I found it interesting to read about that, where many of these kids have some of the same experiences that we did as TCKs. And certainly international adoptees, depending on the age that they were adopted. I have many friends who've adopted children from other countries. And depending on the age, if they're an infant, and I'll talk more a little bit about this in a minute, their experience might be they're fully able to grow up and assimilate into whatever culture they were adopted into. But if they were older, they're probably going to bring some of those earlier cultural traits with them. So what has changed? One thing that has changed, I think, is the internet and social media. When I first came back to college, it was very, very difficult to find people like myself. You could stay in touch with your school. They have alumni associations. Remember, these are very small schools. But your connections, often I just had no idea what happened to a lot of my friends unless I stayed in touch with them by written letter. We didn't have cell phones then. We didn't have the internet then. Although for you younger people, we were driving cars. But later, with the advent of the internet, and particularly Facebook, all of a sudden our lives changed completely. And there are now there are alumni groups all over the place. I belong to 3 of them, actually 4 of them. And we are all staying in touch with one another. We're sharing stories. I had a reunion dinner with some friends in Charlotte sometime last year. We were in that restaurant for 5 hours because we had so much to talk about. And in some cases, I'm actually renewing friendships or actually making friends with people that I wasn't friends with at the time that we were in high school together. But because we have this common experience, and as soon as we start speaking to each other, there's this sort of I get you moment. And they all were sharing stories of their, like I said, that when I talked about the reentry situation, reentry is a big one, and to a certain degree it still is. Although, by my age now, I should have figured it out, I think. But I think we carry those skills with us through the rest of our lives when we interact. When we meet people from different countries, we're very welcoming. We're not afraid. We want to find out who they are and what they're all about. I think today's CCKs still have, as you saw in the video with some of those younger folks, there are a lot of cross-cultural kids who are still going to struggle with this, particularly in this very, very highly global world we have now, globally transient world that we have now. And with the advent of, with more social media, more internet connections, more travel, I'm seeing young people today who are just restless going across the United States, and that's probably nothing new. That's always been the case. So one thing I wanted to talk about too is the experience with people who grew up in monocultures. That's still something that I struggle with. I haven't spent this much time talking about my background in years, because it just is I'll come to that slide in a minute. It's just not easy to go down this path because I know people aren't always going to be interested in the whole thing and why this is complicated and why understanding let's put it this way, explaining why you don't fully belong. I think that's the trait that stays with you forever. You don't fully belong. You feel like you're half here, half there, or 1/3 here, 1/3 here. My brother, my one living brother, has decided to stay in Europe, but I've decided to stay here. Why? We have no idea. It's just that you pick some place, you make it home, and you find community, like we always do. Let's talk about, the one other thing I found interesting in the book was when they came to the 4 basic cultural types. And I thought this was really interesting because this is how we respond to people, isn't it? When I talked about how I felt my college schoolmates perceived a foreignness in me, it was probably because I looked like them and I spoke fluent English, for which sometimes I got the response, wow, your English is good. But, you know, oh, you lived in Germany, but your English is so good. You know, that's a common thing to happen. But I looked like them, and I somewhat dressed like them, although I'm sure I made some kind of fashion faux pas in those days, too. So this is really interesting to me because we sort of perceive quickly when we size somebody up that we met for the first time. Do you look like me? Do you look different? Do you sound different? Do you behave differently? Why is this confusing? So I like this slide because it makes me want, I always say I like to get to the soft middle of people. I want to find out more. So maybe I'm going to leave you with that thought, that if you see, if you meet people who have a perceived foreignness or otherness, delve deeper and find out what they're all about. Be curious. And I think looking at this crowd, many of whom I know, I'm sure you do that already. But that's kind of what I have to say today about TCKs, and I'm happy to take questions.
Because I can't wait, I was curious, what was the book that you were basing this on?
This book is, and if it doesn't look dog-eared, it's because I bought it on Kindle and read it on Kindle, so it looks like I didn't read it. But this is and I'm happy to loan this out. It's Third Culture Kids, David Pollock, Michael Pollock, and Ruth Rieken. Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds. And it's the later edition includes a lot of things that David Pollock originally wrote about, but they've added a lot of this newer research.
What do you think what the best part of being a TCK is when you look at this point and you're like?
So the question was, what's the best part of being a TCK? You know, it's interesting. Sometimes I get the question, what was it like? That's another $64 million question. What was it like? Well, I could very easily ask all of you the same thing about your background. What was it like? You'd say, well, it was what it was. You know, I don't know anything different. that was how I lived. That was normal for me. I think probably the best thing about it was my parents preparing us for adventure. In fact, just this morning I was reading on Facebook a post that a fellow TCK and a friend of my brother's in high school wrote about his dad. And this guy who's writing it is Canadian and lives in Vancouver, but his parents took the kids and lived in Italy for many years. That's where we met. And he writes a tribute to his father and his father's sense of adventure and says, you know, let's go do this. And then he thought maybe they were ready to go back to Vancouver one day in the 1960s. And the kids all said, no, we want to stay. So I think the gift that our parents gave us is probably the best, particularly if, you know, I'm half European, so I have, there's more to me than just my Americanness. And so that is a gift too.
What languages do you speak?
The question is, what languages do I speak? Well, they're all way back in the recesses of my brain now because I have been living in the US for a number of years. But I did study Italian when I was in middle school in Italy and spoke it fairly well for a middle schooler. We all, of course, in all of these international schools, by the way, you were required to learn the home language. So you couldn't get out of it. It wasn't an option. In Germany, I studied both German and French, and I could get along quite well in both languages. And even for a while, I worked in my college breaks, summers and winter break. I worked at Goodyear in my dad's office, and I had to use all those languages because they would have me substitute for a secretary who was on vacation or something, and I was answering the phone in 4 languages. Because being in a multinational corporation, you're hearing languages spoken all day long, and more than just those 4.
So when you were in class, did you speak English, or was the basis of
Yes, the question is, was I schooled in English? Yes. Okay. Also, my parents had made the decision when we left Sweden. 2 of us were born in Sweden, and I was 3 when we left. They made the decision not to continue for us to be bilingual. They made the decision to continue only English with us, which is regrettable. But the reason they did it is because my oldest brother struggled in school when he first came back to the U.S. They thought it was because he was bilingual. I think we know now it's because he had a severe hearing loss that wasn't discovered until he was 9 years old. Can you imagine? So my first language has always been English. The international schools that we went to were all the instruction was in English, although you could hear languages, many languages all day long. And of course you're studying foreign languages and you're interacting with the world around you on a daily basis.
Were there other ways that your schooling was different because they were in those international schools? You know, what you learned?
The question was, are there other ways that our schooling was different? I would say the 2 international schools that I went to, and there still exist today, by the way, they probably resemble more American private schools than they do American public schools. They are based on an American system, largely, but in the sense that you go through grade levels, kindergarten through 12th grade. All the schools are K through 12, by the way. They separate kids, of course, into the various class groups and age groups, but everybody's on the same campus. And I think our preparation for college was probably in some ways stronger. And I think it's because, look at our parents in those days. They were all educated people, at least in my subculture of European-raised TCKs. And I know that's a subculture, I'm aware of that. So I think there was a desire for our parents and the people who led the school, who sometimes were our parents, for us to have a really solid education. So we didn't have home ec, we didn't have we had some sports. We didn't have a whole lot of sports because these were tiny schools. And so we had pretty rigorous education. So I think that's one thing that was different. Any other questions? Yeah.
Because of this, the fact that you were from different places, what did you think about the connection to your family in some of these places? Was it just you and your parents? Did you have grandparents?
That's a great question. The question was about what my connections were to other family. As it happened, my mother's mother lived with us for a long time during those years because she had become a widow, and so for many of those years I had a grandparent living with us, and she was the American grandparent. And she, bless her, you know, joined the American Women's Club and still played bridge and things like that. But she got a driver's license and drove around Italy and Luxembourg, and you know, she got herself around. She figured she also assimilated very well for a woman her age, which she would have been in her 60s and 70s then. We also stayed, I had family in Sweden. My mother did not have any siblings, so there are no cousins on that side, but I did have aunts and uncles and cousins in Sweden. The older generation is all gone now, but so we stayed in touch with our Swedish family very closely.
So if you compare that to say someone like yourself who's in MCC, monoculture, the relationship to our family is greater here in America, where I'm from, and that our distant relations, some of which were alive when I was very young, in Scotland and England. I never visited, of course, and they never came to America. But do you have a different sense of that versus someone who stays here and has extended family in Europe or another country that never has any contact with them? Do you feel any difference between that? Do you feel closer, or?
I probably feel closer, but I think that's probably not, that may not be common for TCKs. I mean, they may have families scattered all over. Look at Barack Obama, who never saw his father after a certain point. You know, their families are just as complicated for us as they are for people raised in monocultures, I think. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to. And also, I think you know, we can have distant relations. My mother had some cousins and uncles that I didn't really meet very much. I actually knew more about my Swedish family than my American, not cousins, but uncles and you know, distant relations on that side. But I had more contact with the Swedish side of the family than the American one. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Anything else? I've lived in Asheville 18 years, which is the longest I've ever lived anywhere. And I am very happy not to move again. I still have dreams about moving. You know, I think we all have, you know, you have your repeat dreams, or the chronic story that is never resolved in your head. And there are two. One is the moving van is outside and I'm not ready. And number two, I've got to get to the airport. That's a real and I'm not ready. I'm going to miss the plane. So yeah, those things kind of stick with you. So I have I still actually have some anxiety when I travel for that reason. Which sounds odd, but you know, we're not like these perfectly adapted people any more than anyone else is. We just kind of make do. Anything else?
Well, it's kind of a statement. So it's kind of interesting because my parents were missionaries, and I know we've talked about this a little bit. And I don't think I'm a tradition. I would not identify necessarily as a TCK. However, I grew up in Hawaii, and we moved around a lot. And Hawaii is its own little world made up of all these different cultures, which is in itself its own little universe. And it's fascinating because it is completely different from the rest of the continental U.S., you know, or the mainland. And it's funny because I identify with a lot of the things that you have said about assimilating and coming back into, you know, coming back and trying to come back to the normal culture and things. And I had a hard time when I came back to me.
That completely makes sense to me. And you and I talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, and you were nodding the way we all do when we all have dinner in Charlotte.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
I understand.
yeah. And it is, I think that's why I think this more recent research that they've done, you're a cross-cultural kid. Absolutely you are. Your parents were missionaries, that you were moving from place to place, but living in Hawaii, you were exposed to a lot of different cultures and an island culture.
It's almost like going to all these different all these different countries in one place.
Yeah,
You know,
that makes sense to me.
it's very fascinating. But what was your, out of all the countries that you visited, which one was your favorite?
I can never answer that question. The question is, which was my favorite country? I can't do it.
You can't.
Can't do it, yeah. And I've tried to go back to all of them. I haven't been back to all of them, but going back is hard. Going back, if you've ever tried to do that, go back to the neighborhood where you grew up.
Not yet.
It actually can be I was amazed the first time I tried to do that how painful it was. And I think it's because of what we talked about, the unresolved grief. When you drive around where you went to school or the house you lived in, for some reason I find it extremely painful, even though I'm curious to do it. But how did I get on that subject? But that was,
I don't know. I haven't even had the courage to do that.
yeah. But I think it's good to do it. I think it kind of gets. I wouldn't have known about that unresolved grief had I not done that and tried to reconnect in a way. Not that it's resolved, but anything else? Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate your listening to the story of my life.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Karin.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you for hosting. I guess you're all going to get to read my email.